On March 14, 1849, officials described it as an unfortunate accident involving an overturned lamp when the county courthouse in Loon County, Alabama, went up in flames. But in the ashes, investigators uncovered something that contradicted the official narrative. Down in the basement, chained to iron rings embedded in stone, were 3 sets of human remains. The destruction was complete for county clerk records spanning 1847 to 1849, property deeds, marriage certificates, and most critically, the probate documents for the Sutton estate, all gone. For more than a century now, descendants of Loon County families have murmured about what truly transpired at Bell River Plantation during those 2 years. About Colonel Nathaniel Sutton's twin daughters, and about an enslaved man named Marcus who somehow managed to document everything before he simply vanished. What you're about to hear has been assembled from surviving letters, medical records out of Mobile, and testimonies given to a Northern Abolitionist Society, documents that remained sealed until 1963. Before we go further into the story of the Sutton sisters and the secrets that devoured an entire community, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and click that notification bell. We dig into the darkest corners of American history, the ones textbooks deliberately avoid. Drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We genuinely love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten horrors. The real truth about Bell River Plantation doesn't begin with that fire. It begins with a funeral 2 years earlier, and with 2 women who had been raised to believe that survival meant maintaining absolute control. Back in 1847, Loon County sprawled across some of the richest cotton-growing earth in all of Alabama. Black soil that made men wealthy and carved the landscape into kingdoms, white columned houses surrounded by fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The county seat of Hanville sat at the epicenter, a modest cluster of brick buildings and dirt roads where planters conducted their business and their wives carefully pretended not to know exactly where the family fortune originated. Bell River Plantation was located 8 miles south of town, reachable only by a private road that twisted through stands of water oak and crossed 2 tributaries of the Alabama River. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton had constructed the main house in 1828. A 3-story, 12-room structure with a separate kitchen building connected by a covered walkway. The slave quarters, 24 cabins laid out in 2 immaculate rows, stood a quarter-mile behind the main house. Close enough to be called upon quickly, yet far enough that the colonel needn't hear the sounds of the lives he owned. Cotton had made the colonel's fortune, but his reputation rested on something else entirely. He had served in the Creek War under Andrew Jackson, returning from that conflict with a firm conviction that human beings could be improved through careful breeding, the same way one might improve livestock. His personal library contained medical texts from Philadelphia, agricultural journals from Virginia, and private correspondence with men at universities who shared his beliefs about racial hierarchies and biological destiny. His record-keeping was meticulous, measurements, observations, genealogies traced across 3 generations. His neighbors called him eccentric but brilliant. His slaves called him something far different, though never within white earshot. The colonel never took a wife. Instead, in 1824, he purchased an enslaved woman named Ruth from a Charleston trader. The bill of sale described her as being of uncommonly fair complexion and gentle bearing. In 1825, Ruth gave birth to twin daughters, Sarah and Catherine. The colonel had them raised in the main house, educated by tutors from Mobile, dressed in fine clothing ordered from New Orleans. But he never freed them. He never legally acknowledged them as his daughters. On paper, they remained his property, an arrangement that granted him absolute authority over every facet of their existence. Sarah and Catherine grew up in a peculiar state of isolation. They learned reading and writing, how to paint watercolors and play the pianoforte. They studied literature, mathematics, geography, and French. But they rarely stepped foot off plantation grounds. The colonel controlled who came to visit and when, filtering every potential social interaction through his own rigid criteria. He told them they were exceptional, that they had been afforded advantages that elevated them far above their station, but that the world beyond Bell River would never understand them, would never accept them. He taught them that safety lay in seclusion, that trust was a weakness, and that power, however limited, was the only currency that actually mattered. The twins absorbed these lessons far too well. They developed their own private language of glances and gestures, finishing each other's sentences, sometimes falling silent for days and communicating solely through notes passed across the dinner table. They wore identical dresses in coordinating colors, Sarah in deep green, Catherine in midnight blue. They read the same books at the same speed, one starting from the front, the other from the back, meeting somewhere in the middle. They shared everything: hairbrushes, jewelry, secrets, and eventually something far darker. Their mother Ruth died in 1839. Pneumonia was the official cause, though whispers circulated through the slave quarters about bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes during those final weeks. After her death, the Colonel's grip on his daughters tightened like a noose. He installed locks on their bedroom doors that could only be operated from the outside. He demanded weekly written reports on their activities, their thoughts, their dreams. He began testing them, leaving valuables in obvious spots to see if they would steal, introducing them to male visitors to gauge their reactions, manufacturing scenarios intended to expose any hidden rebellions. Through all of this, the plantation itself continued to prosper. By 1847, the Colonel owned 63 enslaved individuals whose labor produced 142 bales of cotton annually. He sold his harvest through factors in Mobile and reinvested the profits in more land, more slaves, more books for his ever-expanding library. The slave population at Belle River displayed an unusual demographic profile, a disproportionate number of light-skinned individuals, more children than the birth rate should logically have produced, and a disturbing pattern of families being broken apart and sold off just as children approached adolescence. The overseer, a man named Jonas Pritchett, had spent 15 years working at Belle River. He occupied a small cottage near the slave quarters and executed the Colonel's orders with mechanical precision. Pritchett maintained his own records, punishment logs, work assignments, dietary restrictions for slaves the Colonel had designated for his breeding program. These notebooks, written in Pritchett's cramped hand, documented atrocities with the casual tone of farming reports. Which women were forced into which cabins? Which children were sired by which men? Which pregnancies were terminated, and by what methods? Up in the main house, Sarah and Catherine understood more than their father ever realized. They read his journals during his business trips to Mobile. They listened at doors, gathering fragments of conversation between Pritchett and the Colonel. They knew what took place in the quarters after dark. They knew which of the slaves shared their blood. They knew their father regarded human beings as experimental subjects in his personal laboratory of racial theory. And they learned to despise him with a cold, patient fury that would have terrified him if he'd ever recognized it. The morning of February 3, 1847 arrived with unseasonable warmth, temperatures climbing into the low 60s even before noon. Colonel Sutton had spent the previous evening in his study, working by lamplight on correspondence with a professor at the Medical College of South Carolina. The household staff noticed nothing unusual when he failed to appear for breakfast. He often worked through the night and slept late. It was Pritchett who found him at 10 o'clock, slumped in his leather chair with papers scattered across his desk. The Colonel's face had taken on a grayish tinge, and when Pritchett touched his hand to rouse him, the skin felt cold and waxy. Dr. Amos Grayfield arrived from Hanville 2 hours later and pronounced Colonel Nathaniel Sutton dead, estimating time of death sometime between midnight and dawn. Hard seizure, Dr. Grayfield declared, barely glancing at the body. Man was 56 years old, worked himself to exhaustion. I warned him about his choleric temperament and excessive mental strain. The heart gives out. Simple as that. But several details didn't quite fit this tidy diagnosis. The Colonel's dinner tray, brought to the study at 8 o'clock the previous evening, sat untouched on a side table with the food barely disturbed. A cup of coffee, long gone cold, showed a peculiar residue at the bottom, a fine sediment that glittered faintly in the lamplight. The Colonel's final letter, addressed to his attorney in Mobile, remained unfinished mid-sentence. I have made certain arrangements regarding the future of my daughters which must be executed precisely as stipulated for their own protection and for the preservation of my life's work. Should any person attempt to, the sentence simply stopped there, the pen trailing off the page as if his hand had suddenly lost all strength. Sarah and Catherine stood together in the hallway outside their father's study, wearing matching black mourning dresses that they had somehow procured despite having no prior knowledge of his death. Their faces showed no tears, no sign of shock or grief. They held hands, fingers interlaced, and observed the proceedings with identical expressions of watchful calm. "We should examine him more thoroughly," suggested Mr. Harold Breenidge, a neighboring planter who had arrived to pay his respects. "Nathaniel was in good health last month when I saw him at the courthouse. This seems rather sudden." The colonel worked himself into the grave, Dr. Grayfield snapped, irritated that his professional judgment was being questioned. "I've seen it 100 times. The body simply gives out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with the daughters about funeral arrangements." But Dr. Grayfield never got that conversation. Sarah addressed him first, her voice perfectly modulated and cold as January rain. "Dr. Grayfield, we appreciate your prompt attendance. The funeral will be held 3 days hence with burial in the family plot. Mr. Jeremiah Osgood, our father's attorney from Mobile, has been summoned and should arrive by tomorrow evening. Until such time as the will is read and the estate settled, Catherine and I will manage the plantation affairs. Pritchett will continue as overseer under our direct supervision." The men in the room exchanged glances. Women didn't manage plantations. Certainly not unmarried women barely 22 years old. And there was something else, something they couldn't quite articulate. A sense that Sarah and Catherine had been waiting for this moment. That they had rehearsed these words and knew precisely how events would unfold. "Now, Miss Sarah," Mr. Breenidge began in the patronizing tone men reserved for women discussing matters beyond their comprehension. "You can't seriously expect to. Our father educated us specifically for this eventuality," Catherine interrupted, her voice a mirror of her sister's. "We understand crop rotation, market factors, the management of field labor. We've studied his methods for years. This plantation will continue to operate at its current level of productivity." What the men didn't know, couldn't know, was that Sarah and Catherine had prepared for this day for months. They had studied their father's account books, memorized the names and capabilities of every enslaved person on the property, learned which merchants in Hanville could be manipulated and which needed to be avoided. They had planned for every contingency except one, the specific contents of their father's will. The funeral took place on February 6 under gray skies that threatened rain but never delivered. 43 neighbors and business associates attended, gathering in the parlor where the colonel's body lay in a walnut casket lined with white satin. The Reverend Samuel Yates from Hanville's Presbyterian Church delivered a eulogy that praised the colonel's contributions to Alabama's agricultural prosperity and his devotion to advancing scientific knowledge. Not one enslaved person from Bell River attended the service, though they gathered in the quarters that evening for their own ceremony. A mixture of Christian hymns and older traditions, singing songs that celebrated liberation and the settling of accounts. They kept their voices low, but the sound carried across the fields to where Sarah and Catherine sat on the main house veranda. "They think they're free now," Sarah said softly. "They'll learn differently," Catherine replied. Jeremiah Osgood arrived from Mobile the evening after the funeral. A portly man of 50 with silver hair and the careful manner of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to people who could afford to make his life difficult. He carried a leather satchel containing Colonel Sutton's will and several sealed documents marked for the twins' eyes only. The reading took place in the colonel's study, now thoroughly cleaned of any evidence of his final hours. Sarah and Catherine sat together on a settee, their black morning dresses rustling slightly as they adjusted their positions. Pritchett stood by the door, uninvited but tolerated, his weathered face expressionless. Osgood opened his satchel and withdrew a thick document bound with black ribbon. Colonel Sutton revised his will on December 12, 1846, less than 2 months before his death. The provisions are unconventional. The document's opening paragraphs were standard, charitable bequests to the Presbyterian Church, personal items distributed to various acquaintances. Then Osgood reached the section concerning the plantation and its inhabitants. "To my daughters Sarah and Catherine Sutton, I leave the entirety of Bell River Plantation, including all lands, structures, livestock, equipment, and human property, to be held jointly and equally between them. However, this bequest is conditional upon the following stipulations, which must be satisfied within 24 months of my death." Osgood paused, cleared his throat uncomfortably, and continued. "First, both daughters must enter into lawful Christian marriage with men of suitable character and standing approved by the executor of this estate. Second, Both marriages must produce legitimate offspring within the stipulated time frame. Third, the daughters must maintain the plantation at current levels of productivity and demonstrate sound management of its resources. Sarah's hand tightened on Catherine's, their knuckles going white. Should these conditions not be met, Osgood Reed, his voice dropping lower, Bell River Plantation and all its assets shall be sold at public auction, with proceeds distributed equally among the following charitable institutions. The list included agricultural colleges, medical societies, and organizations dedicated to the advancement of scientific understanding of human populations. The Colonel's final attempt to ensure his ideology outlived him. "There's more," Osgood said, withdrawing a second document. "A private letter to you both." He handed the sealed envelope to Sarah, who broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. Inside, their father's handwriting covered 3 pages of heavy cotton paper. Catherine leaned close, and they read together in silence. The letter explained the Colonel's reasoning with chilling clarity. He had observed their unnatural attachment to each other, their rejection of normal feminine interests in courtship and marriage. He had concluded that they would never voluntarily separate, never form appropriate alliances with men who could continue his work and properly manage his estate. So he had created a situation where they had no choice. Marry and procreate or lose everything. But the letter's final paragraph contained something more disturbing. "I have made arrangements to ensure you choose wisely. My network of correspondence extends throughout the state and beyond. They will be watching, reporting back on your conduct and your choices. Remember always that you are what I made you, and you cannot escape the fundamental truth of your nature, no matter how you might pretend otherwise. The blood that flows through your veins is both your privilege and your prison." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. When she looked up at Osgood, her expression betrayed nothing. "We understand the terms. Who serves as executor?" "I do, along with Mr. Breenidge as co-executor. We're charged with approving any marriage proposals and ensuring the conditions are met." 24 months, Catherine said. "That gives us until February 1849. "Correct. I must say, ladies, your father's provisions are highly irregular. Most attorneys would have counseled against. Our father's mind was entirely his own," Sarah interrupted. "We'll comply with his wishes. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have plantation business to attend to." After Osgood left, promising to return in 6 months to assess their progress, the twins remained in the study. They sat in their father's chair, Catherine on the seat, Sarah perched on the armrest, and looked at the walls lined with journals and medical texts, at the ledgers documenting 2 decades of human experimentation disguised as agricultural management. "We can't find suitable husbands in 24 months, Catherine said finally. He knew that. He designed this to fail. "Not if we control every variable," Sarah replied. "Father taught us that much. He believed humans could be bred like livestock, that every aspect of reproduction could be managed and directed. We'll prove him right, just not the way he intended." "What are you suggesting?" Sarah stood and moved to their father's desk, pulling open the bottom drawer where he had kept his most private records. She withdrew a leather-bound journal and flipped it open to a page marked with a silk ribbon. Father's breeding logs. He documented everything. Which combinations produced which results, which bloodlines he considered superior, which individuals he designated for his program. Catherine joined her, reading over her shoulder. The entries were clinical, dehumanizing, describing people as if they were cattle. Purchased male approximately 25 years from Williamson Estate. Good teeth, strong back, quick to learn tasks. Letters visible on back indicate prior ownership in Virginia. Paired with female number 4. Results: 1 male child sold 1837. 1 female child retained for future breeding. He was a monster, Catherine whispered. He was, Sarah agreed, but he was also thorough. And somewhere in these records is the solution to our problem. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Catherine immersed themselves in their father's documentation. They discovered the full scope of his obsessions, journals spanning 20 years, detailed genealogies, physical measurements, observations on temperament and capability. He treated Bell River as a laboratory, its enslaved population as experimental subjects, all in service of his theories about racial hierarchies and human improvement. But within that documentation, they found something unexpected, evidence of intelligence, resilience, and resistance among the very people their father had tried to reduce to data points. Slaves who taught themselves to read despite prohibitions. Women who used herbs and folk knowledge to control their own fertility, quietly subverting the colonel's breeding program. Men who sabotaged equipment and slowed productivity in ways that appeared accidental. Their father had noted these deficiencies without recognizing them as acts of rebellion. One name appeared repeatedly in the later journals, always with annotations of frustration. Ruth, their mother. The colonel had purchased her expecting a compliant bearer of children for his experiments. Instead, he had found a woman who resisted him in subtle, persistent ways, teaching her daughters to read when he was away, whispering to them about the life she had known before slavery, planting seeds of doubt about his absolute authority. She tried to protect us, Catherine said, tracing her finger over their mother's name in the ledger. Even when she couldn't save herself. Then we owe her more than survival, Sarah replied. We owe her victory. But victory required resources, time, and one more element they didn't yet possess, a man they could control completely, whose presence would satisfy the letter of their father's will while violating its spirit entirely. The solution arrived in late April, though they didn't recognize it immediately. The spring auction in Haynesville drew sellers and buyers from across central Alabama, transforming the courthouse square into a marketplace of human misery. Enslaved people stood on a raised platform while white men examined them like livestock, checking teeth and muscle tone, asking invasive questions about work history and health. The air smelled of dust and sweat and fear. Sarah and Catherine attended with Pritchett, ostensibly to purchase additional field hands for the expanded acreage they planned to cultivate. They wore black veils, still in mourning, which gave them anonymity in the crowd and allowed them to observe without being observed too closely. The morning sales proceeded predictably, field workers going to plantation owners, domestic slaves to town families, children torn from parents and sold to different buyers. Then, shortly before noon, something unusual appeared on the auction block. Next lot, the auctioneer called. Property of the Granville estate, recently deceased. One male, age approximately 28, name of Marcus. Got his letters, can figure, worked as a house servant and tutor to the Granville children. No history of rebellion, no attempts to run. Starting bid, $1,000. Marcus stood on the platform with straight posture and level gaze, neither defiant nor submissive. He wore clean but worn clothing, and his hands, the hands of someone who worked with ledgers rather than cotton, showed no calluses. His skin was several shades lighter than most of the people sold that morning, suggesting mixed ancestry. But what caught Sarah's attention was something else entirely, the way he scanned the crowd, not with the defeated resignation she expected, but with calculation, as if he was evaluating potential buyers just as they evaluated him. Educated slaves are a risk, someone in the crowd called out. Gets ideas above his station. Perfect for a household that needs bookkeeping done, the auctioneer countered. How many of you can balance your own accounts? Here's a man who can do it for you. Now, do I hear 1,000? The bidding opened slowly. Most planters didn't want an educated male slave. Too much potential for trouble, for reading abolitionist newspapers, for forging travel passes. But a few town merchants showed interest, seeing value in someone who could manage their stores or handle correspondence. Sarah leaned close to Pritchett. Bid. Miss Sarah, we don't need, bid. Pritchett raised his hand. 1,000. 1,200, countered a merchant from Montgomery. 1,300, Pritchett called. The bidding climbed to 1,600 before the Montgomery merchant dropped out, shaking his head at the inflated price for a single male slave, educated or not. Sarah had paid more than market value, a fact that would fuel gossip in the weeks ahead. Marcus was delivered to Bell River 3 days later, walking the 8 miles from Hanville with his few possessions in a cloth bag. Pritchett met him at the plantation entrance and led him directly to the main house, where Sarah and Catherine waited in the study. You can read and write, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. Marcus's voice was educated, careful, revealing nothing of what he might be thinking. You tutored the Granville children. What did you teach them? Reading, writing, arithmetic, some geography and history. Whatever their father requested. Catherine circled him slowly, appraising. The Granvilles were known abolitionists. Quakers, I believe. They allowed their slaves to be educated. For the first time, something flickered in Marcus's eyes, weariness perhaps, or recognition that this conversation was more complicated than it appeared. Mr. Granville believed all people possessed souls and minds worthy of development. Ma'am. And you? Sarah asked. What do you believe? I believe I'm standing in front of two women who paid too much for me and who clearly have something specific in mind beyond field labor. The twins exchanged glances. Their father had taught them to view enslaved people as objects, incapable of analysis or autonomous thought. Marcus had just demonstrated both within 30 seconds. We have an unusual situation, Sarah said carefully. Our father died recently, leaving conditions on our inheritance that require creative solutions. We need someone educated, discreet, and capable of understanding complex arrangements. What kind of arrangements? The kind that must remain private within this household, Catherine replied. You'll live in the main house, not the quarters. You'll have access to our father's library. You'll be treated well, fed properly, given freedoms that would be extraordinary elsewhere. But in exchange, you'll do exactly what we say when we say it, without question or hesitation. Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. And if I refuse these unnamed terms? Then you'll be sold south, Sarah said flatly. To cotton plantations in Mississippi, where educated slaves are worked to death in the fields to break them of any intellectual pretensions. I can have you on a boat within a week. It wasn't an empty threat, and Marcus clearly knew it. What do you want from me? That depends, Catherine said. Can you keep secrets? Even ones that could be used as weapons. I've kept secrets my entire life, ma'am. Had to survive. Sarah walked to the window, looking out across the plantation grounds. Our fathers will require us to marry within 24 months or lose everything. But we have no intention of submitting to marriages arranged by men who view us as property to be managed. So we're going to subvert the terms while technically fulfilling them. I don't understand. You will, Catherine said. But first, we need to know if you can be trusted completely and absolutely. Over the following days, Sarah and Catherine tested Marcus in ways both subtle and overt. They gave him access to their father's library and watched what he read. They asked his opinions on political matters and listened for hints of abolitionist sympathies. They observed how he interacted with the other enslaved people at Belle River, whether he attempted to organize or agitate. Marcus proved remarkably adaptable. He kept to himself, spoke carefully, and demonstrated an intelligence that had clearly been honed through years of navigating dangerous social terrain. He understood that educated slaves existed in a precarious position, valuable enough to be kept, dangerous enough to be feared. What the twins couldn't know yet, was that Marcus had his own secrets and his own agenda. The Granvilles had indeed been Quakers with abolitionist leanings. More than that, they had been part of an informal network that collected testimony from enslaved people about the realities of plantation life. Marcus had spent 5 years documenting atrocities, recording names and dates and details in a coded shorthand he had developed. When the Granvilles died, both within a week of each other from fever, their relatives had sold off the estate, including Marcus, before anyone could discover the trunk hidden in the root cellar containing years of carefully preserved evidence. Marcus had managed to retrieve his most important notebooks before the sale, hiding them in a hollowed-out Bible that no white person bothered to inspect. He had been bought and brought to Belle River, expecting another period of careful observation and documentation. Instead, he found himself at the center of something far stranger and potentially more dangerous. By mid-May, the arrangement had clarified. Marcus would serve as the twins' private secretary, managing household accounts and correspondence. But more than that, he would be their confidant in a scheme they hadn't yet fully explained. Sarah revealed their plan one evening in early June after the house slaves had retired to their quarters and the three of them were alone in the study. "Our father's will requires us to marry and bear children within 24 months, she began. "The executors must approve our choice of husbands, men of suitable character and standing. But the will says nothing about the husbands being suitable for us, only that they meet external criteria." "I'm not following," Marcus said. Catherine smiled, and there was something almost feral in it. "We're going to marry men we can control completely. Elderly men, or sickly ones, or men desperate enough for the connection to a wealthy plantation that they'll agree to any terms. Men who will give us legal legitimacy without interference in how we run Bell River." "And the children?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to understand. "Biology is biology," Sarah said bluntly. "Our father spent 20 years proving that lineage can be strategically managed. The executors need to see marriages and pregnancies. They don't need to see what happens behind closed doors." The full implications hit Marcus like cold water. They wanted him to father their children, to create the appearance of legitimate heirs while the twins maintained control through marriages that existed only on paper. "You're asking me to commit an act that could get all of us killed," he said slowly. "If anyone discovered, no one will discover," Catherine interrupted. "We control this household completely. The marriages will be arranged carefully. We'll manage every detail, every possible witness, every piece of evidence. You'll be protected." "Protected?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "I'm a slave. There's no protection for me. If this fails, you'll be ruined socially, perhaps sent away somewhere. I'll be hanged or burned alive." "Which is why you'll be motivated to ensure it doesn't fail," Sarah said. "And in exchange, you'll receive something worth the risk." "What could possibly be worth freedom?" Catherine said quietly. "Documented legal freedom and enough money to go north and start a new life. We'll wait until after the children are born and the estate is secure. Then we'll manumit you, provide funds, and send you away with a cover story that holds up to scrutiny." Marcus looked between them, searching for deception or false promises. "And if I refuse?" "You won't," Sarah said with certainty. "Because you want freedom more than you fear death, and you're smart enough to recognize this as your only real chance." She was right, and he knew it. But there was something else at play, something the twins hadn't considered. Marcus saw in their scheme not just a path to personal freedom, but an opportunity to document and expose the entire system. If he could gather evidence about the Sutton family's secrets, about the Colonel's experiments, about the network of planters and overseers who had collaborated in decades of atrocities, he could send that information north and strike a blow against the institution that had stolen his life. "I'll do it," he said finally. "On one condition." "You're not in a position to make conditions," Catherine said. "I am. If you want my cooperation rather than my resentful compliance, I want to know everything. Your father's journals, his correspondence, his breeding logs, all of it. If I'm risking my life for this scheme, I deserve to understand the full context." The twins considered this. Giving Marcus unrestricted access to their father's papers was dangerous, but refusing might create exactly the resentful compliance he had mentioned. "Agreed," Sarah said. "But you'll study them here in this room, under our supervision. Nothing leaves this house." "Acceptable." What none of them said aloud was that they had each just made a bargain with someone they didn't fully trust, gambling their futures on a deception so audacious it could only succeed if every element aligned perfectly. And in Loon County, Alabama, in 1847, perfection was in very short supply. The summer months brought oppressive heat to Bell River, the kind that made the air thick as syrup and turned every physical task into an ordeal. But inside the main house, behind closed shutters and drawn curtains, a different kind of pressure built. Sarah and Catherine began their search for suitable husbands with the cold calculation their father had taught them. They needed men who met the executor's criteria for character and standing while being vulnerable enough to manipulate. They compiled a list from Osgood's suggestions and their own observations of Loon County society. The first candidate was Mr. Edmund Varley, a 68-year-old widower whose cotton operation had struggled since his sons moved west to seek opportunities in Texas. Varley had been a friend of the Colonel's and expressed immediate interest when approached about a potential match with one of the twins. A beautiful opportunity, he declared during his first visit to Bell River in July. His watery eyes roaming over Catherine with an expression that made her skin crawl. Union of two fine properties. Continuation of your father's legacy. I'd be honored to guide you through the complexities of plantation management. Catherine smiled and said nothing. After Varley left, she scrubbed her hands raw in the wash basin, as if she could remove the memory of his palm on her arm during the tour of the grounds. He'll do, Sarah said clinically. He's desperate to restore his reputation after last year's failed crop. He'll agree to any prenuptial terms to secure the connection. I can't, Catherine whispered. Sarah, I can't let him touch me. He won't. That's the point. The marriage is legal fiction. Marcus fathers the child, Varley gets credit, and we maintain control. But arranging two such marriages proved more complex than anticipated. The executors, particularly Breenage, had strong opinions about suitable matches. When Sarah suggested she might marry a merchant from Mobile, a man of 42 with moderate success in the cotton trade, Breenage rejected him immediately. Unsuitable background, he declared. Your father intended you to marry into established planter families, not the commercial classes. The man's grandfather was an indentured servant, for God's sake. The twins pushed back, arguing that the will's language didn't specify planter families, only men of suitable character and standing. But Breenage held firm, threatening to petition the courts to clarify the will's intent if they continued pushing inappropriate candidates. He's trying to force us into marriages that benefit him, Sarah fumed after one particularly contentious meeting. He has sons, you realize. He's probably angling to marry one of us off to his own family. While the marriage negotiations dragged on, Marcus immersed himself in Colonel Sutton's papers. What he found there exceeded his worst expectations. The Colonel's breeding program had operated for 2 decades with systematic brutality. He had forced specific pairings, sold away children who didn't meet his criteria, and separated families with no consideration for human bonds. He documented everything in clinical language that dehumanized people into data points. Female number 7 shows resistance to breeding assignments. Recommend increased discipline and isolation to induce compliance. But the journals also contained something else, evidence of a network. The Colonel hadn't worked in isolation. He corresponded with other planters, with medical professionals, with academics at Southern universities. They exchanged research findings, compared methodologies, and discussed ways to advance their theories about racial hierarchies and human improvement. Marcus began making careful copies of the most damning entries, using paper Sarah provided for household accounts and writing late at night when the twins had retired. He developed a system for hiding his copied pages inside a hollowed-out section of his mattress, building a secret archive that would eventually travel north. But he also began to notice something the twins hadn't mentioned, the pattern of illness among Bell River's enslaved population. In late July, 3 women in the quarters developed symptoms, lesions, fever, progressive weakness. Pritchett reported it casually, suggesting they be isolated and given minimal care until they recovered or died. But Marcus had read the Colonel's private medical notes and recognized what he was seeing: syphilis. The Colonel had infected multiple women, either deliberately as part of his research or through his systematic sexual abuse. Now the disease was spreading through the quarters, passed between couples, transmitted from mothers to infants. Marcus brought his findings to Sarah and Catherine one evening, laying out the medical texts he had found with their father's annotations. Your father gave them syphilis. Either he contracted it himself and spread it, or he exposed them deliberately. The journals suggest both. And it's killing them. Catherine's face went pale. How many? At least 7 showing symptoms now. But syphilis can remain dormant for years. There's no way to know how many are infected without proper medical examination, and even then, he trailed off, the futility evident. Sarah stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back rigid. Can it be treated? Mercury treatments sometimes, but they're almost as dangerous as the disease itself. And expensive. And would require a doctor willing to treat enslaved people properly. He didn't need to finish that sentence either. Do it anyway, Sarah said without turning around. Purchase whatever medicines are needed from Mobile. Have a doctor come out. And if he refuses to treat them adequately, find someone who will. Miss Sarah, the cost, I don't care about the cost. Our father did this. We're not going to let them die from his depravity. It was the first crack in the facade Marcus had seen. The first indication that the twins might be motivated by something beyond self-preservation. He filed it away as valuable intelligence. Dr. Grayfield arrived 2 days later, irritated at being summoned to treat slaves. He examined the sick women with barely concealed disgust, confirmed the diagnosis, and prescribed mercury treatments with the cheerful confidence of someone who didn't particularly care whether the patient survived. Course of treatment takes months, he said, washing his hands in the basin a house servant provided. Can't guarantee results. Frankly, might be more economical to just isolate them and let nature take its course. Replace them with healthy stock. We'll take your prescription, Catherine said coldly. And we'll need you to examine the entire slave population. Everyone. Identify all potential cases. Grayfield's eyebrows rose. That's 40+ people. The expense is ours to bear. When can you begin? The examinations took place over 3 days in August, conducted in a cabin Pritchett cleared for the purpose. Grayfield worked with mechanical efficiency, noting symptoms in a ledger and dispensing diagnoses with the bedside manner of a livestock inspector. The final count was worse than Marcus had feared, 14 confirmed cases, another 8 probables. Nearly a third of Belle River's enslaved population had been infected by the Colonel's systematic abuse. Sarah and Catherine absorbed this information in silence. Then Sarah made a decision that would have shocked their father and confused their neighbors. We're treating all of them, she announced. Purchase the mercury, the bandages, whatever's needed. Improved rations for the sick, they need strength to survive the treatment. Reduced work quotas. And Marcus, you'll oversee the treatments. Keep detailed records of who receives what and their progress. Miss Sarah, Pritchett objected. This is going to cost thousands of dollars and reduce productivity significantly. Your father would never, our father did this to them, Catherine interrupted. We're correcting his damage. The expense is irrelevant. What the twins didn't articulate, even to each other, was the complex motivation behind their decision. Partly, it was pragmatic, dead slaves couldn't work, and the plantation's value depended on its labor force. Partly, it was guilt, recognizing their complicity in their father's system, even as his victims. But partly it was something else, something neither wanted to examine too closely, the recognition that their father's greatest crime wasn't the specific atrocities he